Hey, Foothills, we are in the 4th chapter of 2 Samuel, and we are going to have some fun and learn some stuff today. I can tell you this. For me, the first 5 chapters or so of 2 Samuel seem like something out of Game of Thrones. It is full of treachery, betrayal, violence, murder. And while we're wading through all of that, there are a couple of important overarching principles that really do stand out. So let's take a look at them. In the first verse of chapter 4, it begins with Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son. And you found out in chapter 2, he was made king over Israel by the general Abner, while David was king over Judah. And in verse 1, it says that Ishbosheth had lost courage because Abner had been murdered by Joab, David's general. So Ishbosheth became afraid because Abner, who obviously was a mere man, had made him king. He put his entire hope in Abner, unlike David, who was brave and hopeful because God had chosen him as king. So Ishbosheth is a picture, a clear picture of those who put their faith in man and the ways of man. And we can see in his example and others in this chapter, it just simply leads to death. It continues to say in verse 1, all Israel was disturbed. So this whole idea of trust in man had affected all the people who followed this king. Abner himself ends up badly in the last chapter because he ignored God's decree that David was the rightful king. Now, on the other hand, David had learned to follow the ways of God. Even when he stumbled, he repented completely, and God protected him and elevated him to king over not only just Judah, but all of Israel. So this is the first takeaway. We need to evaluate, are we taking things into our own hands, or are we seeking God's direction in our life? Now, back to Ishbosheth. Things really did fall apart for him. It was so bad that 2 of his commanders, Benah and Rechab, dreamed up a scheme to jump over to David's side and find favor with him, of course, by murdering and beheading their king. So these brothers are another example of rejecting God's direction and taking things into their own hands. They had to have known that David had been anointed to be the next king, but they had aligned themselves with Ishbosheth. Well, it seemed that he had power. Once they saw this wasn't the case, they immediately devised a plan to go over to David's side. Not because he was God's choice, but because they were operating out of fear of man. They thought that they were taking care of themselves. So they executed the king and traveled through the night to bring his head to David. Big mistake. They really had no understanding of David and what would bring them favor with him. They also didn't understand the consequences of denying God's authority. Let's pick it up in verse 8. Then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my Lord, the king, vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants. So David answers them, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress. When one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much worse when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own bed, shall I not require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Oops. Verse 12 tells how David responds to this unrighteous killing. He knew this wasn't honoring to God, and that was his standard. He has them killed and their hands and feet hung up as a warning to others. There are all sorts of times in the life of David, especially here in 2 Samuel, where he explains how he honors who God honors, and that the blood of people killed throughout 1 and 2 Samuel is not on his hands, but on the hands of the murderer. He learned that the hard way with his murder of Uriah. He knew how God feels about human treachery, betrayal, and violence, or just simply taking action into our own hands. Living outside of God's direction always ends up very, very badly. But the second takeaway from this that I see here and throughout the Bible is that God is sovereign. He can turn the wickedness of man to his own purposes. We'll see that throughout the rest of 2 Samuel. God bless you, church.